and tenured professor at IIM Lucknow.
Live streaming is on.
Professor Chatterjee completed a successful term as director of IIM Kozhikode from 2009 to 2014 and was reappointed as director of IIM Kozhikode for a second term beginning 2018. During Professor Chatterjee's term as director, IIM Kozhikode has gained global recognition and created a national impact. In the latest rankings released by the Ministry of Education a couple of days ago, IIMK has been ranked 4 among the country's management institutions. So Professor Chatterjee will share his insights on leadership with you during his sessions today and next Saturday. I'm sure you will learn many things about leadership and management during these 2 sessions. So over to you, sir.
Thank you. Nanda Kumar, who eats and breathes and whatever needs to be done with strategy. So I'm not going to go there any more than what he has done and what he proposes to do. You know, the thing is that strategy, according to me, is a very overrated word. And leadership is a underrated concept because everybody thinks that leadership is something that can be done without preparation. Strategy you have to learn. I couldn't disagree with that anymore. I have a sense, as a great American scholar said that, who popularized the idea of strategy from McKinsey Harvard School. The name of the man is Tom Peters, and he said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I have just going to add another dimension, which is that leadership eats culture for dinner. And I would like you to kind of look at leadership as the frame from where we are going to come. We are all priests of our own domain of knowledge and we disown everything else. And so the focus is on leadership. And I would like you to, I will make a nudging because I really don't know that subject of strategy. I have practiced it, and a lot of people, when I used to write those books earlier, used to say, Professor Chatterjee, your ideas are phenomenal, very esoteric, but do they work in practice? Now that I've been for 15 years CEO of institutions across 3 continents, I can say with absolute certainty that my practice has revealed the hollowness of many of the theories, not just of mine, but of others. And I'm going to go and demolish some of the conventional understanding I had about strategy and leadership. And hopefully you will disagree with me, because in that disagreement, there is some knowledge creation. So you agree with everything I said, then there's no fun. All right, so I'm going to lay out some issues before you, which are going to be of relevance. So not that you don't know them, but I need to remind you of what the reality today is very different from the reality of 2 years back. In organizations that we all run and sit in, you are leading from the laptop rather than from the top. Fundamentally, this is a major shift that has happened. As much as I would like Nanda Kumar sir to look up to me when I sit on a high pedestal, I cannot do that anymore because we are on a flat screen. And I do not have any more advantage of hierarchy than what the technology allows. Hierarchies are giving way to multi-hierarchies. Doesn't mean hierarchies are gone, but there's a multiple hierarchies that are emerging. And I can see that with absolute clarity. Technology taking some of the organizations that never had a chance to be seen in the forefront of business, like the medium through which you and I are talking to each other, Zoom. Zoom's market capitalization is many times more than American Airlines. And you can imagine Zoom was just a non-entity a few years back, and 2 years back. Now you can see what has happened to that organization. And so your organization resembles a cost efficiency treadmill that applies analytics and big data to existing operating models. If your company is not doing it now, it's going to do it later. And it's a matter of time. There's an emergence of distributed, collective, and network leadership. You need to confront disparities in access to digital devices and internet connectivity. So the world is not as seamless as one would like to believe. It is not as connected as one would imagine. There are disparities, and you have to understand that disparities are not just in terms of geographical dispersal, but they're also, in terms of the demographics, how people are, regional variations, demographic variations. People are not comfortable with technology, lots of things. So we are seeing that you need to confront disparities in access to digital devices and internet connectivity. The question for Chief Human Resource Officer, you may not be one here, but your chief human resource officer, whether standardized processes have replaced the creativity and innovation of high performers, because you don't get to see those high performers up front now, because you standardize most of the process of access to people. So it's very difficult for me to decipher whether there's an innovation cooking which is not sort of traced as yet. Employees register concerns about the future of hybrid work. Leaders are becoming pinch points for a fluid system with moving targets. This is the recipe for a perfect storm if you're a leader in enterprise. Leadership is changing, and leadership is becoming more about selling pain than inspiring people. I think you have to sell the pain of a lot of things, losses. That is a primary task of a leader in the times that we're going to see going forward. Challenge is to bring the whole person to work, paving the way to the new possible and acting as a human capitalist. This is very, very clear to me as technology takes over. The critical elements of what constitutes leadership will shift largely to understanding and articulating the finer and subtler aspects of human nature. I may sound a little abstract now, but I'll get more and more concrete as we go along. In the age of hybrid working, the range of performance between disengaged and fully committed employees is dramatically greater. You can see this. If somebody is not paying attention to work and is a cover of technology, you're not meeting these people, right? And so it's very difficult to now separate a high performer from somebody who's just sort of winging it, as they say in the corporate world. Proximity with employees is key to identifying potential people-related challenges as well as future leaders and hidden champions who contribute more quietly yet still in a significant fashion. I'll give you a couple of examples in case I thought I was just rattling off stuff from my head. Tata Consultancy Services, using a new secure and borderless workspaces model, plans to have 75% of its employees work from home by 2025. A recent McKinsey Global Institute survey suggested that 70% of business executives said that their companies were planning to engage more temporary workers and freelancers than they had before the COVID-19 crisis. A multinational cola company in Bangalore, and are allowed not to speak their name, are sending office chairs to their employees so that they do not need to visit offices anymore. CEOs are likely to continue to automate and outsource the purely transactional elements of their work, and this will be a point of no return. And then you will have to ask, how do we grow? How do we get ahead and stay there by outlearning others, reaping value from data, and utilizing the ecosystem to drive value creation? So I have chartered my own understanding of what the landscape of strategic leadership is, whatever you mean by that word, all right? And then I would like to decode very slowly what we might want to do. So let's go to the first, let's go to the master slides, and then we'll ask this question. Can you see the visual here? So can they see it? Okay, all right. So insights of strategic leadership 4.0. I'll define each of these words, but the first two words are actually from my book. You got copies of that? Have you got copies of that yet? Okay, and I hope you will read the book and not use it as a support for a wobbly chair or a table, because most corporates don't read unless they're meant to ask to read. Just as a measure that you read it, I'll ask Prasananda Kumar to allow me to verify from the review of these books in Google. You have to review this book, at least a couple of lines review, just to see how you felt. Even if you feel bad about it, write about it. I don't care. All right, as long as you've read it. Okay, you blame me, you praise me, but don't be indifferent, because that book is meant to be read, not to be kept, right? And that's why I've given you a physical copy, because you're tired of digitals. Physical copy of the book is always more welcome for me, and I hope it is for you. So what I would expect is I'll cross-check my what do you call Google India review account for the book and see if your name surfaces there, and I'll be delighted if it does. Right? I will not punish you if it doesn't, but I feel very bad that you have not listened to somebody who really knows a little bit about the subject. All right. So Leadership 4.0 is something that might be enigmatic, but let me put before you a result of a survey that I did with CEOs in 5 continents, right? And this is about 150 sample size. But if I ask this question to them, what is the major coping problem faced by a CEO? Let me look at it from the CEO's, not necessarily a leader's perspective, but about a CEO's perspective. So as a large segment said that, 41%, in fact, I cannot listen for long. Very interesting. I can't listen for too long. Why can't you listen for long? Because you're in the business of talking all the time. Listening is not part of your normal habit. Unless you've learned and you've disciplined yourself to do that. So that is one major coping problem. The other coping problem, 23% of the sample size said, I have a tendency to be too diplomatic. So it's very strange, right? So you can't call spade a spade, you will not face facts, you will just sort of wriggle out with elegant play of words, something that you've learned from middle management days. And so we all do that to some extent, but being too diplomatic is going to be a coping problem. Tendency to be too diplomatic and cannot handle negative feedback. That's very interesting. Well, I have a problem of accepting negative feedback. Now, how do I process negative feedback? It becomes a very critical value in leadership, particularly strategic leadership. So what is the primary task of a leader? And we asked them, and they said bringing clarity of purpose, overwhelmingly 66%, bringing clarity of purpose, but very few people could actually define what clarity meant for them. I want clarity of purpose. Okay, and so what is clarity? Well, I'm not clear about clarity, but I want it. Reminds me of a beautiful lady who got on a plane sitting next to a very famous economist called John Galbraith. And she was sitting and she looked at him and said, are you Galbraith? He said, yeah, so I disagree with you. He said, you disagree with what of mine? He said, whatever you wrote. I said, what did I write? That I don't know, but I disagree with you. So I want clarity. But I do not know what it means, right? So I want clarity. So I've been asking CEOs who run Fortune 500 companies, so what is clarity? And so I get an answer that's absolutely vague. And I said, okay, so you haven't understood what clarity is. Let's do it together. Not that I know a lot more than you do, but I've given it a thought. And then there were minuscule issues around primary tasks, aggressive talent management, developing an engaged workforce, shaping high-performance culture, navigating change. These were some of their concerns. What is the most important quality of a good leader? Again, the topmost thing was very close to the topmost thing was clarity of mind, ability to articulate a vision, personal humility, deliver on promises, influence others in thoughts and actions, develop other leaders, leave behind a legacy, right? And what is the one thing that you should have done in your organization but have not done for a few years? And a lot of people said, managing my own energy. Trust me, most CEOs do not have an energy management regimen. They have a lot of agenda, but they do not know that this is their internal energy. That is the recipe for whatever you define it. There is no energy, there is no strategy, there is no leadership, right? And so fundamentally, it's a function of energy, and they haven't managed that for a long time. That was interesting. Prospecting my successor was another challenge. Others, please specify, and others was effective implementation. So that was one of the issues that also cropped up. Implementation was a challenge. And so I'm giving you a very simple model, so we don't beat around the bush and go on. This is the context of Asian leadership, and I'm just sharing with you where the real problem is. And Hewitt Associates did a little survey, and we realized that strategy and execution were connected by a simple factor. The factor was called engagement. And most problems in Asian organizations was that engagement was pretty low. The engagement factor was extremely low. And we are talking about a high power distant civilization. See, you look at culture surveys across the world, you look at Western European and North American organizations, we have low power distance. We look to the boss and the subordinate. Apparently, you can engage a little more informally, but there's high power distance, and therefore engagement becomes a real challenge, not because there is high power distance, but because there's little understanding of how to engage a human being. All right? None of your strategic intent will work unless you know how to engage a person. Who's going to execute? You don't execute. A leader's job is not to get the work done through his own devices. It's about influencing others who would do the work. And the process through which you do this is engagement. The sum total of what you do is engagement, right? Now, I heard L&T's CEO, who was CEO forever, because he said, I can't find another person as good as mine is. That's the height of... He's also currently heading L&T, but that's all right. Everybody is entitled to his own grandiose vision of who he is. I'm not disturbing that. What he says is something very interesting. He says, sometimes he speaks very insightful things. So I would, from his years of experience, he's saying that you get dedicated employees very easily by paying money. But to get a devoted employee is almost an impossibility. It's very difficult. It's not a function of how you pay. So between devotion and dedication, there is this whole slight, engagement issue. Now, how do you engage your people in a manner that they deliver on the strategic intent that you bring to the organization? The strategy is the little I have understood of strategies, from multiple options, you choose a specific option to get a specific result, right? But the means through which you have to do is engagement, and you engage people, not just machines. And this is where the real challenge is. Now, I'm going to show you from the world of art, because leadership then becomes not a science anymore, because the science of strategy has to be now replaced by the art of leadership. Fundamentally, strategic, you do a dashboard of strategy, but then how do you engage a person to deliver on some of those great ideas that you have? Corporate America had an expression called Bohica. Bohica was something like this. Like your boss in Silicon Valley went to Hawaii for a program and you were sent to Hawaii. And there was a difference in class of training. And when the boss came back, he had a expression on his face as though wisdom had just dawned on him, and he'd give you one jargon word, whether it was innovation, quality, 4.0, whatever it is. And you're expected to down the line, download his idea. And the middle managers had a defense strategy. It was called Bohica. And when you decoded it, Bohica meant bend over, here it comes again, which means boss has come inspired. And he's going to download the newfound inspiration that he's got from Mount Sinai or somewhere. And now he's going to say, everybody, and then you see this oftentimes in organization, new ideas, and he's going to download a whole new data which is not assimilated properly, but he's learned it in Harvard or somewhere, or maybe I'm Code, and then he goes down and he says, and without engaging people, he says, you have to get it done, and everybody says, Bohica, bend over, here it comes again. So they just wait for a while until he gets the next idea, right? And nothing happens. We see these organizations all the time. So what was missing here? What was missing is engagement. But this is not a science. As Professor Nanda Kumar would have almost made it clear to you that it is based on a lot of data processing. I completely disagree with that premise, because I fundamentally think the art part of it is the most critical value that you bring. And so what is that art part? I'm going to show you two performers, right? Two orchestra performers. And one of them, both of them are conductors. One of them does it in one way, another one does it in another way. And I want to relate the two on the basis of your perception of who's a better leader of the orchestra, right? Once you give me your data, then we will decode that. So here we're talking about engagement, right? You have a bunch of people who's doing the performance, and you are actually choreographing the performance, and see how this plays out. So let's see the first one. Daniel. Yeah. One still comes later. Can you hear me? Okay. Rate this individual conductor on your scale of 1 to 10. You may or may not understand Western music. You may not know how it is conducted, but based on your primary impressions, how do you generally rate that? Mentally, you can rate it. You can write it down. Rate this person, and I go to the next one. Okay, and so you see the next person who's performing, and then you rate this next person as well. Then we'll compare notes. Yeah. Rate Bernstein and rate the first one. Now, can I see some show of hands who would like to report it? Let's start with Reggie, who seems to be the most engaged as far as I can see. So, Reggie, can you unmute and tell me how would you rate these two?
So, Professor, when you asked us to rate the first time around, I wrote an 8 for the first person.
Okay.
But then when I saw the second person, and then I reflected back on the first person, because none of the musicians are actually looking at the conductor.
Mm-hmm.
They are engrossed. But the second person was so involved, while the first person was more intense about the activity as a conductor, while the second person his engagement level was a different dynamic compared to the first person. While the first person may be physically engaged, the second person was intensely engaged. That's the difference I saw.
So what would be the score, ratings now, revised score? What would be?
I flipped it around. It was a 4 and 8. 8 for the second person, 4 for the first.
Okay, interesting. Good. Thanks a lot, Reggie. Manisha, would you be able to tell us how you rated them?
Yeah, so sir, I rated the first one as 7.5 and the next one I will rate 10 out of 10. The reason for this is that the first person is very energetic and very engrossed in the activities that he is doing, but it looks like nobody is enjoying the activities that they are doing, and he's looking more of like he's commanding and pinpointing at certain points, okay, for certain things, whereas the second person who was coordinating looked more of like a person who trusts the team, okay, and he had that very calming effect. He himself is enjoying the work that is being done, and to an extent the people who are working also seems to be enjoying that. So that is the reason that I have given 10 out of 10.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Amit, what did you say?
Sir, when I heard perhaps the first one, I was like deeply involved into it, and perhaps I rated him almost like a 9 because it was very good. But when I saw the second one, I perhaps changed my mind, and where I felt the difference, and if I have to correlate what you just mentioned, the difference was between dedicated and devoted. So the first one, he was more into giving directions and people were executing it. When I saw the second one, he himself was not giving any direction, but he was so involved, and the employees or the people in the orchestra were so devoted towards their work that his expressions were basically getting the work done. So the team was also enjoying, and the leader was also enjoying, and his expressions were speaking. So for me, I had to revise my rating for the first one as 7, and the second one could be a 9 or even a 10.
Right. So we'll ask Rubina to give your views on this, and then I will get into the discussion. Rubina, go ahead.
Sure. So I gave 7 for the first one, and the second probably a higher. What difference I saw was the first was more of a technical, he was just following the instruction, which is very conventional from ages probably, and he was following that, and people were following that. But the second one was more innovative. I felt I have never seen, in past somebody doing with their expression. So I think the people were more involved with his expression, with the face, and not the action and conventional way of following instruction. So that was creative in my respect.
Okay. Rina, what did you say to this? Please unmute. Unmute. Yeah. You can't hear you still. You can't hear. There's something wrong in the transmission. Suhani, you can speak. Meanwhile, Rina, get your system sorted. Yeah.
Professor, I felt that the first one is 7 in a normal situation, but 9, 10 in a difficult situation. So say if there's a fire in the building or something like that, and then if you have to direct someone, new concept that you are trying to share upfront in front of a huge audience, then the first one is good. The second one is someone whom I think any creative team would love to have a person like that, because he is a bit more into depth. But what will be needed for that person to be successful is that everyone understands his nuances well. So a long time with probably that team would probably be needed, or if everyone is a very high performing team or is very emotionally understanding, only as in that would be needed for the first person, or that curve has to be brought up for the first person to deliver. So 10 in a good situation, 7.
Interesting. Rina, are you
Professor, can you hear me?
Yes, very clearly. Go ahead.
Yeah. For the first one is definitely commanding for everybody to see. The second one is about connection. So as they say, with connection, there's a correction, and then there is a coherence, and there's a harmony. So the second one is definitely very innovative, but I think very much apt to our new style parenting, new age parenting style, where you correct the child by having a connection with the child. In a similar manner, it was almost like a parent-child relationship. There's a connection established with the team, and with a little bit of wing, a little bit of smirk, and a little bit of a smile is able to engage everybody so harmoniously. So there is a connection that can be seen. It was an infrasonic way, the way I put it, a very infrasonic, you can't really see it, but there's a connection, Whereas in the commanding goes intense, it can be verbose, dramatic, verbose, and it's dramatic. There is essentially no connection per se. There is no friendship or connection or understanding of each other as such. So that is the difference which I saw in both of them. The first, by my ranking, would go like 8. The second, I would give 10. But for some people with we do have conventional leaders who, for them, it is very difficult to diversify or upgrade the way we are trying to upgrade ourselves and going to be future leaders. But there are certain, other leaders, not trying to make ageist remark, but 50 plus, little older generation to us, who has actually quite rigid and it was very difficult for them to diversify, that resilience. For them, this will suit.
Moved away from music to diversification. I'm pretty concerned about music as of now, but I appreciate your comment. It was very, very insightful. I appreciate that.
I need to say it works for some age group.
Absolutely.
Some school of thought.
We got it. Thank you. Niladri.
So the first person is, we can say, demanding, more at a physical level. And the second person is more at a spiritual level. He is commanding. His wish is their command.
Interesting. Okay. Venugopal, you have the last word, and then.
Yes, Professor, thank you. So the first person I feel is very technical, and he is generally a command and control kind of a person. And the second person is very expressive, and he's gelling well with the team. So with the team, it is a bit easy to understand the first person's way of communication, but you need a team which will understand those expressions in this second case. So my rating would be 7 for the first person and 10 for the second person. So the second person is very subtle. So he's actually mixing his emotions and trying to create a sound out of his emotions. So it would require a team which understands that emotion to know how to create that sound. Whereas for the first person, it is a direct command and control, and he uses all the techniques. But the first person looks like he's like sweating a lot. He's like sweating a lot, but the second person is actually going with the flow.
Yeah.
So I would say 7 for the first and 10 for the second person.
Great.
The second person is doing it joyfully, and first person, I think, is not able to conserve his energy.
Okay, wonderful. Appreciate. There's a very, very valuable comment, insightful, extraordinary, insightful comments, which means you've understood from your work ex how to connect one frame from, there's a lot of noise going on in the background. Please, if your audio is causing it, make sure you mute it, because they ask, can you hear me clearly? Okay, so they're not hearing me. All right. So all I'm saying that the sum total of insights that you've got to bear speaks of the amount of experience and exposure you had. I'm very lucky that I'm addressing a group that brings that richness of experience. I'll start, and in fact, with Suhani's comment. He says, for me, it seems like a contextual thing. One person will actually deliver much better value than the other if the context was X rather than Y. So we have all understood that leadership is a function of context. So suppose if I were to, what style? A lot of people ask me, so what is the style of leadership that I would have? And I'm teaching a whole class on art of leadership, 82 of them, and this is a 32 hours engagement with them. The interesting thing is that I did a survey and I found out that of the three dominant styles of leadership, which is directive, which is what you really hold charge and direct, and the second is participative, the third is free rein, which means you allow people to do, but there is barely enough nudge them. Large percentage of people that responded, corporate India's leaders responded, they were 80% was participative in their orientation. And only a minuscule was directive, another minuscule was free rein. Free rein is followers can decide what leaders is just going to be a token leader. And all I'm saying is it is possible that you mistake style for the context in which you, so what would be the style of leadership when somebody's drowning on a lake that I see in front of me, and I have the option of choosing, my strategic weapons are either I choose a yacht or I take a motorized speedboat. Whichever would I take if somebody's drowning? Obviously a speedboat, right? I want to get there fast. But if I were to enjoy the journey, not somebody's not drowning, I just want to have a good time, I would not take a speedboat, I would take a yacht. So that I have the luxury of time, I'll go there. Now, what style you'd adopt would depend largely on what the context demands from you. You understand what I'm saying? So what style you adopt will depend on what context. So leadership, as long as it is a highly contextual process, the patterns of engagement between the leader and the follower will vary from context to context, depending on what you want delivered, what you want executed, right? So what I would have to do as a leader is to keep my options open for a whole repertoire of skill sets and styles, whole repertoire of styles, so that I know what to. So if you say I will only be participative and your organization needs a surgical attack on some aspect of the business, your being participative will not help. To build consensus will take so much time that the opportunity that presents itself will go away from you. So you need to be directed. You need to be assertive. Sometimes you need to be hugely participative. Sometimes it can be a free rein, but depending on the maturity level of the organization, the context you're in. And so fundamentally, like the orchestra player, you see Bernstein. Bernstein has matured. Bernstein was not created in a day. So just his wink and his orchestra, his ability to communicate the subtlety by the wink of an eye, we call this high fidelity organizations. I'll give you an example of high fidelity organization. Apollo Hospital emergency ward. Or if you want a more exotic example from America, because America is always better than whatever I quote from India, you go to Mayo's Clinic, right? And you see what kind of leadership there is. If a patient comes, emergency patient comes, there's a hierarchy, of course, in the hospital. But the moment an emergency patient enters, all hierarchies are gone. Because as a person who's going to receive this individual who's had an accident and has driven himself to the hospital, and there's a dog in his car, there's somebody taking away his dog, somebody is helping him, and all doctors accompanying him, getting his basic data transmitted from the journey from the car to the emergency ward. And by the time he enters the emergency ward, his entire biodata is there on the flashing. with the doctor ready for the takeoff, and he lies on the bed and looks at the ceiling and he sees beautiful Italian painting from the Sistine Chapel or something, and he looks at that painting because he's relaxed looking at the painting, and doctors do their business. This is called a high fidelity organization. Look at United Colors of Benetton. Whenever a sweater is sold anywhere in the world, people say that a ship in Australia, whom Benetton will now shave for the wool, is begun to shiver because there's a high fidelity connect between one sweater being sold and the source of the raw material, which will supply and replace that sweater that's sold. And so that kind of fidelity is critical in an organizational life. Fidelity to what? Fidelity to your context. Fidelity to what is demanded at that moment. So if I have a strategy, grand strategic intent, and if it is not followed backed by a repertoire of skill sets, we need a Pancha Pandava. It's not Arjuna's arrow is not always good enough. You need wings. You need to resist it. So the whole point is the ability to see a repertoire of skills that would be required to plant the strategy in the emerging context which you're not aware of as yet. So fundamentally, the game that we are going to play going forward after COVID-19 is a fast-changing landscape, and so you have to deal with inadequate data in an uncertain environment. So an unstructured mode of delivering strategic intent. What you need is a whole range of skill sets. Now you may say, I'm just one person, my style is fixed, right? How can I change from all of a sudden from being autocratic to democratic overnight? No, you don't have to do that. You have to get people in your team who can do that for you. So if you thought leadership was a solo game, where I'm the CEO, so I'm the designated leader, CEO is not equal to leadership, for God's sake, don't make that confusion. CEO is just a designation. Leadership is a very different phenomenon. Okay, so if you understood leadership as driving strategy through a barrel with only a hammer, that is an archaic view of strategy. Please bury it wherever you need to bury it. It does not make sense to me. I'm talking from a practitioner's point of view, and I'm saying that in the course of a day, I deal with so many uncertainties. I get a call from a student who's making a first day in my job, and I'm cold, and I asked this question: can you get me a cup of coffee, please? And I said, for God's sake, do you know who you're talking to? He says, I don't know, tell me. And this is a landline, and I make out it's a student. And he says, well, tell me who you are. I said, I'm your director. He said, oh. Then he says, do you know who you're talking to? I said, I don't know, tell me. And then he puts the phone down by saying, thank God, you don't know who you're talking to. And I have no control over him as long as I don't know who the hell he is. So I think I'm supervising 1,000 people in campus with 2 eyes, and 2,000 eyes are looking at me all the time, mapping every emotional shade in me. And so imagine having to manage the energy, the mental blocks, the mental capabilities of so many people with just, it is humongous task for one individual. You're not a god. Not as yet, you may be in the future. But I'm saying, is it possible that you would like to look at leadership in a very different light from what you did so far? And at the end of the day, after lunch, you should go back and say, well, I must throw away some of the junk that I was carrying in my head about leadership, strategy and all of that. And this is going to be important because execution, which is critical to effectiveness of the leader, is incumbent not on strategy, it is incumbent on him, because everybody, you see, grand strategy you can borrow from some of the top organizations. But how do you engage your guys? See, I can borrow the best models of education of Harvard, MIT, but the moment I have to come to Kundamangalam in Kerala and implement with a Malayali, who doesn't understand 90% of what I'm talking about, I have to now find ways to engage him in ways that he understands exactly what I mean by what I'm saying. And so this is the primary problem. This is a primary challenge that all of us as leaders face. And I'm talking from my own 15 years of heading institutions, that this is the toughest job, not a great strategy. The ideas are so easy to get now. But while you implement, then you realize that the idea that you had initially is now transformed into another idea. Something you never had initially when you started working in it. You look at any guy who's produced wealth in recent years, a very old friend of mine, Chandani of Naukri.com, and people asked him about vision, and I said, vision kuch nahi tha, garage se shuru kiya tha. Vision came later. And so the thing is, this grand stuff that you talk about is only an afterthought, not a prior thought, because while you implement it, you discover, oh, there are different ways of doing it, and these methods are very unique to individuals. So there's an art involved in it. It's something that whose outcome cannot be predetermined. That's why no two work of art is the same. If you look at a Picasso, you look at other masters, no two people will draw the apple in the same manner, because there's no predetermined conclusion. There's a uniqueness of the method. See, the God that filters through your brain is a different God altogether. Through your neural circuit of 30 trillion connections, you are beginning to see the world very differently. And so the patterns of engagement become very different. Therefore, leadership cannot be considered a deterministic science like an algorithm. It is bound to be an art where your subjective capabilities are dealing with. So you're dealing with million minds. And you have to decipher what is the unifying factor. And it's not an objective process. It's not something you can find out through an algorithm, through a formula. You see what I'm saying? And I'm telling you that this is the notion of leadership that in the 4.0 world will have relevance, increasingly so, when you understand the 4.0 world. Can you activate this? It's not working. And so is it possible to look at engagement? Is it possible to look at engagement and understand what will be the elements of engagement? So what is the human personality that I'm engaging? This first person you're engaging, forget about many kinds of ways you'll discover human being. Each human being, each one of us, is a combination of four primary elements: rationality, emotional fluidity, willpower, and ingenuity. Only four. Now, if you look at these four combinations, and then you realize that there's a million people like snowflakes. All the snowflakes look alike when they fall, or the waves when they hit the seashore, they look alike. But not a single pattern of wave is identical with the one that came before. Not a single snowflake is identical with the one that is following next to it. Why? Because that's how nature designs. The creative ability to reinvent yourself every moment. Figure out what you're going to do, be good at, what you're not going to be good at, who could do this better. And this ability to be constantly engaged with these four elements of the human personality: rationality, emotional resilience, willpower, and ingenuity. This is the defining value. These are the defining factors of engagement. If you do not understand these four elements well, you cannot be a leader. If you don't understand human nature well enough, you cannot be a leader. So let's go to the next frame. This is fine. This should be operational. I'm going to now move. You have understood me, right? Okay, so let's start with how leadership began. I'm going to talk about the evolution of leadership as a subject, right? You thought leadership was what it is today. I mean, it hasn't happened overnight. You are looking at 1.0. Leadership 1.0 was about muscularity, muscles, size, physicality. If you have the largest buildings in the town, you are supposed to be in the best business. You look at the bank buildings. All banks have the tallest buildings in the city. You look at the land, size of the land. This came straight from the agrarian world. Size matters. Physical domination is equivalent to leadership, right? So this is the orangutan model, or you can say King Kong model of leadership. So the bigger your chest size, bigger your muscles. The women had no chance, and you would hardly see women leaders in history. If you go to agrarian world, it's all macho men with a certain dimension, physical and otherwise. But as you move from 1.0 to the industrial civilization, which is the beginning of the leadership 2.0, what you see is that machines are replacing those muscles. So methods and machines are displacing muscles as the factors of leadership. So mass production of things that could not be done through muscles. Therefore England and parts of Europe dominated the entire world, colonized the entire world by just those machines. Because muscles were not good enough to repeatedly do the same task over and over again. So mechanization of leadership began with replacing muscles with machine, but then it lasted only for a few centuries. In the 1990s, with Berlin Wall coming down, internet going up, the methods that you saw, machines were replaced by fluidity of information through the digital mode. And all of a sudden, information was power. And fundamentally, if you could choreograph the right information in the right manner for the right context, you could be a leader. So you didn't need to have a shoe factory everywhere to be a Nike or a Reebok. All you need to do is to have the design, and then get the right manpower, pay the right salaries. And so fundamentally, you needed to create the information architecture of the brand, which would then disperse, because the raw material was not the way making of the making of leadership was the architecture of information. You saw my point? Ranajit is a little tired. He probably didn't sleep well. Nevertheless, why am I drawing attention to Ranjit? Because all of a sudden I feel that half of you would be going to the sleep mode. So I have to wake up the whole class, not just for him. Leadership 3.0 was the beginning of accepting the information world. And so the mechanical model of leadership that was delivering value for this big yielded place to another kind of businesses, another kind of set of organizations that began to see information and the architecture of information and the ability to get the right information at the right time as the basis of leadership. And we have examples of organizations. But this lasted only for a while because information became dirt cheap. All right. Now it is not about information anymore. It is not about the content of the information anymore. It is about how do you cognize the content. It is essentially how do you accept insight from the sea of information, and those insights will become the basis of leadership. So the whole thing about leadership started moving from the data out there, the server out there, to the human being, the ability to accept the right insight in the unstructured universe and structure it in a way that you're going to now lead based on ideas. And this is the new name for leadership. And so the evolution part, from the muscular to the cognitive, and then to the intuitive from the cognitive, is the journey. And you can see it is moving from what we call sthula to sukshma, from the crude to the subtle. That's why I showed you the difference between the crude and the subtle. Bernstein makes the same thing appear so subtle, right? Virat Kohli in championship form, Lata Mangeshkar in a best of. See, you can then see the nuances of what it means to be a leader, the leader of the pack. And so fundamental shifts of leadership has become when you move from the sthula to the sukshma. I'll give you examples of Indian history. Most of you who are familiar with, of course, India will know this. The Lodis ruled India. The Lodi Empire, based out of near Delhi, you can see Lodi Gardens and all that. They had the largest number of elephants in India. And so they thought as long as elephants could dominate warfare, they would be the most powerful. And since they had the most elephants, they thought they were invincible. But Babur came from Central Asia on horseback. And the cavalry, the horses of the Mughals, displaced the elephants of the Lodis. Horses were faster. Right? And the Mughals thought they will be there forever based on their power, based on speed and all of that. Until they met the British, who came with gunpowder and displaced those horses. The British Empire took shape based on the revolution that happened in England and the gunpowder that they brought. But the British thought they will rule forever. The sun would never set on an empire until they confronted somebody whose name was M.K. Gandhi. And they had no clue what power he was bringing. He called it the soul power, Satyagraha. They completely outclassed the British in their own game. Fundamentally, they had no clue because their notion of power was all material. Gandhi did not bring material power. He had no large army. I did a little workshop at Harvard where I asked mid-career students, 150 of them, from Harvard, MIT, Tufts, medical school, business school. So I asked them, who's the leader of the millennium? We did a poll and Gandhi emerges at the top. And so I asked them, why did you vote for Gandhi? There were only 4 Indians in this group. One of them said, because he fought with virtually no resource and created so much value. And that's what I call a leader or a manager. And so the fundamental shift that happened with Gandhi was essentially a shift in the way we can use power without any material resource backing it. So the source of inherent power was in the ability of the human being to galvanize that subtlety that is inherent in the human condition. That's part of the repertoire of evolving value of the art of leadership. And that's what I'm presenting here today. No matter how strange this may sound to you, but this is the truth of my understanding of leadership of 35 years, the distillation of which I'm bringing to you. So what is cognitive? What is the distillation? What is the essential ingredient of the highest point of the brain, which is when the brain functions with all its divided? See, brain is an organization: left, right, top, bottom, amygdala, neocortex, visual cortex, audio cortex. Now you can see this is an organization unto itself. Now the one intelligence that runs the entirety of the brain processing is that intelligence. That's the subtle intelligence that we're talking about. That knows exactly where to tap into which part of the organization called your brain, and so that you willing to play those elements that will be required in the given context. You know, a lot of you think that brain can grow by thinking, and that's the stupidest idea that has survived for several centuries. You know, largely driven by Plato, who did not have any idea what he was talking about. He was talking about three brains. He was talking about the dominance of rationality. Dominance of rationality over emotions. The emotions were like beasts, and emotions had to be controlled. And so we had an emotionally neutral, moronic workplace. There were electrons, protons, but there were morons who became leaders, right? And so these morons brought into play a paradigm that did not work. And so Daniel Goleman had to come up with a book called Emotional Intelligence, as though this was a discovery of the Western world. But our ancients always knew that. They said there is something called Hridaya Vritti, there is something called Buddhi Vritti. Hridaya Vritti is primary, Buddhi Vritti is secondary. So you must culture your emotions first. You must understand what emotions you're coming from. They have an intelligence inherent in them. The brain is only a resource allocating machine, like an investor allocates resources in multiple funds. The brain allocates resources based on what is required by the context. Just because you're emotional doesn't mean you will be irrational. But just because you're logical doesn't mean you're doing the right thing. You see my point? A nurse comes to a doctor, they've been working for 20 years, and the nurse says to the doctor, "Doc, I have to propose to you because, you know, the feeling of my heart." So she dresses well and faces the doctor and says, "Doc, look into my eyes, tell me what you see there." And doctor says, "Ma'am, I see the incidence of cataract." Now she says, the bugger didn't get the point, despite all his intellect. So not all intellectual activity is right. You can be precisely wrong, or you can be approximately right. So emotions are approximations, right? So the emotional world is completely cut off. Oh, I do performance appraisal based on 360-degree, blah, blah, blah. I have done tons of them with the best of consultants, and I asked a simple question. I said, how do you actually do performance appraisal? Do you actually fill up the form and add up and say you have been promoted, or do you decide whom to promote? Then you fill up the form. From the truth of your heart, you have to tell me that you actually decide whom to promote. Your emotions come first. 99% of your decisions are emotional decisions. Rationality is a later development growth. And so if you did not pay attention to the world of emotions, this is where art of leadership becomes so much more critical, because understanding emotion is not a science. You have to understand. It's an art. You have to get refined, you have to develop it. So Gandhi is traveling by a train. So Gandhi's evolution was the evolution of emotions. Most people don't understand that. He's traveling by a train, and one of his shoes falls down on the railway track. The train has begun to move. One shoe is there, one shoe is with him. If I was sitting next to Gandhi there, my thought would have been, oh, damn it, with all my intellectual input, oh, how do I get that shoe? What will happen with one shoe? Shall I pull the chain and stop the train? What Gandhi did was he threw the other of the pair on the track, and somebody asked him, what the hell did you do? He said, the poor man will now find a pair. We'll have a pair to wear. One is of no value to me, one is of no value to him. So look at the decision making under limited information set. He errs on the side of the possible, the one. So his decision is based on a noble emotion, not pure logic or rationality. So there are limits of rationality when leadership has to function with inadequate data in an unstructured environment. You think your rationality of the past will work? Damn it, it will not. All your models of the past, will it work? It will not. Your strategic intent borrowed from the past, will it work? It will not. As many organizations are discovering right now. So what do you need? What kind of leadership do you need? You need a leadership that prepares you for the 4.0 world where the game is changing, and game is changing very quickly towards managing the internal resources, navigating them, and coming up with precisely the same solution that your context demands at that moment in time. Are you with me? Am I making sense? Okay. And so we move from the muscular to the methodical to the relational to the responsive. This is what leadership is. So I have to respond to a human need. Okay, I have to respond not just in, we'll have the get this ready. So the algorithmic world, which was part of the leadership 3.0 world, which tells me everything is a function of architecture of information. I have an algorithm for every damn thing. But the point is, the algorithm can take you only this far. It is the limits of logic. Everything that can be broken down into cause-effect relationship logically can be your algorithm. But algorithm will not work when subtler emotions, the world has become subtler. Your algorithms will be you'll be a fool looking at an algorithm, looking at a formulaic way of doing business. So I'll show you a little clip that shows the limits of algorithmic thinking, and our thinking has become largely algorithmic, unfortunately. So look at what algorithms can do and what they cannot do. Let's look at the 4.0 world a little bit.
Open door. Door open.
Radio on.
Playing radio.
Lights.
Lights on.
Protein shake.
Making protein shake.
New York.
Loading New York. Set speed.
4.
4.
6.
6. 16.
4. 16. 4.
4. Correction. 16.
She was too young. Oh, hey, Mia. Good, Ma. Then I was too young. Night down.
Lights down.
Only 16. Only 16.
4.
En klassiker til en annen. Her er Summer of 69.
69.
All right. Now you realize what happens. So if this does not follow a cause-effect relationship that you've already put in motion from the past, unfortunately, reality as we are seeing it is changing so dramatically and dynamically that business models that made us certain that if you do business in this particular manner, we'll get the results that we're getting. Look at what's happening to multiple sectors. Look at how they're completely, sort of not prepared to meet some of those challenges because fundamentally their responses have been based on past data, past experience. So very often people with 20 plus years of experience, like most of you have, they have understood the game quite well so far, leading to your 20th year. But on the 21st year, there is something new that happens. And then 20 years of experience will now start working against you, not for you. Why? Because the new skill set that you need is to deprogram yourself. And that's the most difficult part for the human brain. Okay? Beat the algorithms that are. So if I look at the businesses that are emerging, we have to look at the aspect of engagement in terms of decoding value plus partnership. So if I look at, let's say, let's look at Goli Vada Pav. Let's look at Airbnb as an organization or Oyo as an organization. Two new age organizations. How did they organize their business? On what value proposition? Goli Vada Pav looked at McDonald's burgers. And they said that, if McDonald's is 2 pieces of bread and a patty inside, what is Vada Pav? Vada Pav is also 2 pieces of bread and potato inside. Bread is available all over the country, so is potato. Why can't we be the McDonald's of India? not a bad idea, but you have to engage and execute, right? Idea itself does not, strategy itself doesn't work. So they copied the idea from McDonald's, and then when they tried to implement it, they found out didn't have McDonald's infrastructure there, cash reserves and all of that. So he had to reinvent the business and engage his resources in a very different way. This guy who was running Goli Vada did not have money to advertise like McDonald's would have. So what did he do? He went to the suburban station in Mumbai, told the station master, look, a little kid has lost his parents and the kid is in our counter. Can you announce on your public address system that the parents can look for the kid? They're in the Goli Vada counter. Don't forget to mention this. And the announcer went on and on the whole day, Goli Vada counter, and that's how the name became familiar with all the commuters, right? It may not have been a very ethical step. They engaged, they realized that this was a finger food, so you did not need to sit anywhere, you did not need spoon and fork to eat. So you did not need such a large space like McDonald's would. All you need is a little kiosk like a telephone booth to dispense from a centralized quality controlled Goli. Then the Goli was pre-done and it was transmitted through less expensive channels, supply chain, milk vendors, sometimes newspaper vendors. And they quickly became the number 6 food company in India. Not quite a McDonald's, but they actually created partnership and recreated a value proposition based on how they deconstructed a business and deconstructed it in their own way. So you don't have to have a grand strategy or a great idea. There are existing strategies of doing business. Can you create a value proposition? So real value will not be in the product. The real value will be in the relationship between the product and the customer, and that space was not seen. As you thought a product that was standardized and doing well will do well forever. Not necessarily. The same thing happened with what happened with American design students. They had no idea what internet was all about. They had a spare room in California and in San Francisco, and they thought if they could actually rent this space out in a conference time when a lot of people are looking for alternatives to expensive hotels because they can't afford. So can they rent out this space? And they found their first customer who was an Indian. Okay. And he actually rented this space out. It was called Airbnb because there was a bed and breakfast and the morning and a minuscule hotel price. They rented it out. And then they hired somebody from Harvard who provided the connectivity. The great idea now forbids. And Airbnb became bigger than Hilton Hotels and American Airlines put together in about 7 to 8 years flat. And so if you look at what created that wealth, was essentially that space that nobody noticed between what the product was, what the customer wanted. That space could be created and recreated so many times. And so you have to start to apply your mind, not to memorize what was done in the past, but to deconstruct the past for the future, differently for the future. Now, since we are coming close to breaking time, I'm going to end this session by deconstructing your brain of strategies. So what you see is a cup of tea, right? Pretty much like what I'm having here. But I'm going to tell you that what you see is not what actually it is. What you're seeing is not just tea. You're seeing photons of light falling on a brown leaf, green leaf, turning it brown. That is called chai. You're actually drinking light. But since you can't drink light directly, you're condensing that light by boiling it in water. And that beautiful flavor that you get doesn't make you happy still. So what you do there is you put a few drops of white fluid that a black cow eating green grasses produce. You call it milk. And you stir it. And it has a texture that is color that is beautiful, but you still don't like it. So you pull up the sap of the earth through a pump called sugar cane. And the crystallized version of the sap is what you call sugar cubes. You put those sugar cubes and you stir it. And as you stir that beverage, what you do not realize that you're stirring the Panchabhutas, the 5 elements, air, water, fire, earth, inside a cup. This is a cosmic conspiracy that you're creating inside a cup. That's reconstructing the cup of tea. Now, how do you reconstruct this cup of tea? This extraordinary wisdom. You can't be a philosopher, you're a businessman. So you look at how many test buds people have in India, roughly 5,000 plus. But the test buds are conditioned to tea in different ways. Bengalis like a tea in certain proportion, the Malayalis like it differently, cutting chai in Mumbai is one kind, Kara in Kashmir is different. So you have different kinds of taste buds. So if you can do an algorithm like Amazon does about your taste buds orientation, then you can give me precisely the kind of tea that I enjoy at a premium price by condensing the Panchabhutas into a specific orientation that hits my tongue with a tingling sensation. So you give me the tea that I literally love by condensing, by deconstructing it and reconstructing those channels through which you give me the cup of tea. So just see what you've done here. What you've added is the value of your creative, inventive, cognitive ability to reconstruct. And so every business is going to be reconstructed, believe it or not. The chair you're sitting on is hardly going to be the chair that you'll be sitting on 20 years later. You know why? Because the dentist who's doing a surgery, as I speak to you in Colombia, is using a chair that has got many sensors. So each time his drill goes to your tooth and is about to hurt you, the sensor shows a red blip. And he is going to navigate the drill away from that part of the tooth so that you feel less pain. So he is doing surgery real time by a chair that has become intelligent all of a sudden. Dentist chair is very different today than it was before. Now, if I were to use these chairs in my own way, in my own classroom, I'll put a sensor on each of your chairs and figure out from the data I collect after my class, what percentage of my class you are really attentive. When are you going out to sleep? So the sensor will collect data based on the movement of your back against the chair. If I was in the law and order industry, I'd put a sensor on your car seat. Anytime somebody else stole your car and I'm a policeman, immediately I'll get a trigger that says it's not you in your car, somebody else in your car, right? If I was in the furniture making business, I will use the data that I get, the way you sit on the chair, to customize the chair precisely for your body. So all of a sudden, you see that there's a whole range of options opening up, because the way you're processing your power of engagement with the universe based on structures of information, but aided by those insights that you continue to get. So how do you exploit the world of information in ways that you've not done before? This is the recipe for leadership. So what will be required? You will be requiring your rationality, your emotional fluidity, your willpower, but most importantly, your ingenuity. Something that the algorithmic world cannot do for you. It can break up the past into formula. It can give you relevant data and patterns. But what do you do with those patterns? How do you deal with those patterns going forward and create value for yourself and for others is going to be the name of the game going forward. I hope I presented a very terrifying scene for you, so you really need some refreshment. Have a lunch and have a working. Don't get worked up, because post lunch is going to be the most interesting part of what you're going to get. So come ready with some understanding of how you apply all these ideas in your current context. So I'll take a few questions after I come back from lunch, and then I'll proceed with the rest of it for whatever it is worth. Okay, thanks a lot. Appreciate your time. We meet at 1:59, which is when we start at 2 o'clock, 1:59. Thank you. Have your lunch.
ऑनलाइन कोर्स डिफाइन वो करते हैं, ये तेल लेना ये सब लेना ठीक है, गुड, बट कोर्स करना पड़ेगा। मैं कोर्स का देख रहा हूँ। हाँ अभी कौन सा कोर्स?